you live streamers, I'm not mic'd up, but anyway. We are live streaming, so you may see some microphones here. When you ask questions, if you can project as loudly as possible, that will help them actually hear.
Actually, I've actually, to deal with this issue that we did last time, I put note cards at the end of each aisle. So when we open it up for Q&A, if you can just write down your question, and then we'll pass those forward. And then I'll ask them so that everyone can hear the question that's on the live stream.
Perfect. Sorry, they solved the problem without me. I just want to do a couple of quick announcements. Just a little bit, for those of you who don't know us, we are the MIT Enterprise Forum of Cambridge. We are actually celebrating our 40th anniversary year, so we are sort of the original entrepreneurship group. We do a number of programs. This actually falls into our tactical workshops type programs, but we do programs for entrepreneurs, including all these listed here. Our Start Smart class, we have a mentor program, we do launch clinics, tactical workshops, and we do sort of a startup spotlight demo day at the end of the year. We also do programs focused on identifying technologies that matter. That include things in our innovation series. We do an annual event on IoT, and we have a clean tech industry group as well. Upcoming, we are actually right now taking applications for our mentor program. So for those entrepreneurs in the group here, applications are due September 30th. We actually match people with up to 3 mentors to help you move your venture forward. We have a tour of the Schneider Electric microgrid up in Andover. That's our clean tech group who's putting that on. Should be really interesting. Our first innovation series of the year is on artificial intelligence in healthcare. That's on September 26th. And we start off our fall session of our Start Smart class on October 1st. Those are all sort of the introductory remarks I have, so I'm going to thank Keegan from Caldwell IP for helping us put this on tonight, and I will introduce Keegan.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. Hold on. We good?
Is there a green light on?
Yes.
Great.
Okay. I didn't do as I was instructed and turn my mic on when I was supposed to, but now we're all set. Anyways, thanks to everybody for coming out tonight. The first thing I wanted to do is thank the Enterprise Forum. So I was introduced to the Enterprise Forum about a year and a half ago, about 2 years ago, and then had attended an event. Was curious to learn a little bit more and to learn about possibly sponsoring the Enterprise Forum, and I sponsored at the lowest possible level for the first year, and we just moved up our sponsorship, but really this is thanks for the Enterprise Forum though. Like this has helped us. I started Caldwell Intellectual Property Law in Burlington, Vermont, after I left a larger firm. And then we opened an office here in Kendall Square, and really being part of the Enterprise Forum helped us to integrate into the entrepreneur community here. And we're very grateful for what being part of this organization has done for us. So thank you, Katja, and thank you, Amy and Maham, for kind of welcoming us into this community. And thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight, because we really enjoy giving back as much as we can. So, and that's really what the Enterprise Forum is about, and that's what this event is about, is to give people access to information, entrepreneurs access to information that they might not already have, and that they might really get some things that could be useful in their own endeavors. And so I thought, what better way to do that than to have a panel of seasoned entrepreneurs. So we've got some, I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But thank you to all you guys for coming out tonight. Sam's traveled from Miami, which is nice. Tom is leaving to hop on a flight to London right at 7:30. So if he just tears his microphone off and leaves, we hope that that's where he's headed. And Christian also is driven from technically another state to be here, although not from Providence. And so we're just really lucky to have the level of entrepreneurs that we have here today. And we've added Micah to the panel to really help us think about defining what is open source and to help lead a little bit more of the legal side of the conversation and to add hopefully a little bit to that on top of what these entrepreneurs will. So without me rambling on too much more, just thanks for having us and take it away, Sam.
Me first?
Yes.
See, it's terrible being first. So my name is Sam Abbasi. I'm president and co-founder of Bushido Lab. We're a cryptocurrency and blockchain development firm. Most recent projects are a full-scale decentralized blockchain that we just launched 2 weeks ago, and a project that we currently have with Oracle that's an auditing compliance. My background's in economics, computer science, and a little bit of neuroscience. We're also based in Miami, Florida.
Micah, you want to?
Yeah. My name is Micah Drayton. I'm a patent attorney. I work with Caldwell intellectual property law, and I've worked on various patent applications in the blockchain space, including applications of blockchain and ways of improving blockchain. Essentially, I've had to deal with both the technical and legal issues of blockchain in some detail. That's why I'm here.
I'm Tom Saracen. I'm co-founder and managing partner of Animal Ventures. I spent about 10 years in Silicon Valley, kind of rode the crowdfunding wave, built a company called Rally, and was lucky enough to kind of at the early end of that fund cycle. Sold that company in 2014. Unfortunately, spent about a year at BCG and got out of there as fast as I could. And then when my partner Tina did her TED Talk, we launched Animal Ventures, which is a prototyping firm. We work mostly with Fortune 100 companies and help them experiment and dabble with blockchain.
Apologies in advance, I'm getting over a cold, so I might be a little quiet. But I'm Christian Wentz, founder of a company called Gradient. We've actually had this company in the works for the better part of a year, but only in the last couple of weeks have we made any public announcements. Gradient is building a distributed framework based on trust and authenticity in electronic devices. So we essentially engineer trusted properties into everyday devices and use the properties that gives rise to for interesting distributed systems applications. Before that, I built a company called Kendall Research, which is a neural interface company. It was acquired in 2017, and before that, worked on a wearable sensor company called Misfit, which was acquired in 2015. So, and before that, I was here for undergrad and master.
Right. Well, thanks, guys. And I'm just going to kind of how we've all come to know each other too, because I think that some of that can be interesting sometimes. So I was giving a talk in Miami on smart contracts, and Sam had reached out to me prior to that event to ask me if I'd like to go out to dinner, and so that was how we crossed paths. And
We also drag racing car.
we did drag race your car that night, and that was fun. Although I had just met him, and it was a little frightening, but there was a lot of trust involved from the beginning. And it's been good to get to know each other and to start to work with each other. And Mike and I began to work with each other at the same law firm. Rounding out, I don't know, a little over a year and a half ago, I guess.
Yeah, like that.
And prior to that, I think Mike is being a little bit modest, but he spent several years kind of in an entrepreneurial kind of capacity as an attorney, but primarily focusing on patent prosecution, but continuously working throughout this time with mostly early stage startups. And he has a depth of knowledge into, he's a software developer, He spent 6 years working in industry before, as an engineer before attending law school. And he really brings a lot to the table for all of our clients that work in this particular space. He has maybe an uncommon pedigree for a patent attorney, having a pure mathematics background, and so in this particular space, I mean, he brings it, and we're really lucky. And Tom, I met Tom and Bettina about a year ago at an MIT Enterprise Forum event, and then out of that, we've grown to know each other. I've helped them out with something. I've been helping them out with some things, and it's just been kind of the beginning of a nice collaborative relationship. And Christian, I met also through my last Enterprise Forum event that I held. There was a panelist who has a small kind of family office VC, and in the day after we had and he sat on the panel, and the day after we had that event, he called me up and he said, "There's a guy that I want to introduce you to. I think that you guys will hit it off." And then that week we were able to connect on the phone and got together. So it's really just been there's been some great opportunities to just kind of meet and collaborate and meet new people through this organization and in this particular space of innovation. And I'm excited to be a part of it and glad to have gotten to know all of you guys. So. To get us started, so the format tonight, I'm going to ask about 4 or 5 questions to the panel, and we'll discuss each one of those for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. And I encourage you guys, to go ahead and jot down whatever your questions are, and we'll pass those forward, and I'll review those once we get through these first set of questions. So, Mike, I've kind of primarily asked you to join the panel because I wanted you to help with discussing a little bit about what is open source, and maybe what are some of the just high level, things that are implied with open source licenses, or are they a license, or what are some of the high level considerations that we need to think about when we talk about open source? One of the things that I think happens commonly is that we talk about open source in a way where we don't provide much definition. And when we do so, I think that the conversation becomes misguided. And so I wanted to kind of ask this question on the front end so we can set at least a little bit of boundaries for what it is that we're talking about today. So, Micah, do you want to give us a little bit of a sense about what open source is?
Sure. Well, open source, to me, in practical terms, basically means that refers to software that's been released under open source licenses. And what open source licenses have in common with all licenses is that they grant certain intellectual property rights to users who are subject to the license. Usually in this case, they're copyright rights. So they're rights to reproduce, to use, and to create derivative works, which means, for example, borrowing someone's source code and writing your own program integrating it, or in some cases, just borrowing someone's library of compiled code and making function calls to it. So that's kind of how you sign an open source license. And they're generally free for anyone to sign, and the source code is generally provided for free or in a manner that is free in the sense of unrestricted to users who are willing to be subject to the terms of the license. And they have to be if they use it, generally. Now, these licenses range from more restrictive licenses that impose more requirements on the user. Generally, requirements aim to guarantee that the source code the user produces will in turn be available to other people. And an example of that is the GPL license, on the other extreme, which I think would be represented best by the MIT license, they could put very little restriction on the user's use of the computer program that they produce, or the restrictions that they in turn can impose on it. Now, there's two things that are important, I think, as a sort of a knock-on effect of these licenses. Number one are the legal consequences, and the other one is the practical consequences. The practical consequences are that a lot of the material that is released under these licenses is going to be freely available to anyone who wants to look at it. It's disclosed, which means it's in the public domain, basically. And people will often ask me, how can you patent something in blockchain if it's in the public domain? And they will also ask me, how can you patent something in blockchain if it was given to you under a license, or if it was produced under a license, say a given implementation, that is designed to prevent people from patenting things or restricting access? To answer the second question first, if you're not a party to the license, if you didn't sign it, then the license won't affect you at all, generally speaking, because it generally sounds in copyright, which protects the particular form in which an idea was practiced, as opposed to the idea itself. This is sometimes referred to as the merger doctrine in copyright law. So if you learn all about a given blockchain implementation and then go out and write your own based on what you've learned, generally speaking, you're pretty safe under copyright law, and you're not subject to the terms of its license. The second side to that is some of these licenses are not very restrictive. So they simply won't prevent you from, for example, filing patents. Almost none of them prevent you from filing patents, even the GPL. And many of them won't prevent you from enforcing the patents. And as for the other one, almost any invention that is subject to a patent is basically some kind of an incremental improvement to what has come before, a combination of previously existing elements or a slight improvement to a previous invention. So generally speaking, an invention that's a slight improvement over something in the public domain can often be subject to patent protection, depending on whether you get a patent.
Thanks for that. Really, I wasn't expecting that long of an answer.
Oh, sorry.
Really impressive. No, I appreciate it. That was really impressive. How, and just maybe briefly touch on, how this is relevant for, especially if there's any, new blockchain-related entrepreneurs in the audience today thinking about getting started. How is this relevant for them?
Well, it's relevant because much of the blockchain technology was developed originally under open source licenses. Bitcoin in particular, which is something of a big deal in the blockchain community, was developed under the MIT license. I believe Ethereum is offered under GPL, although it kind of depends on what aspect of Ethereum. Some of them are also offered under the related Afuro licenses. So I suppose if you're thinking of borrowing somebody's library or of using somebody's library to make as part of your implementation, you have to consider what license you're going to be receiving that library under, and whether you'll be able to cope with the strictures of that license. And as with anything else, what's already out there is going to affect what you can get a patent on. So what's publicly disclosed, you have to think in terms of what your incremental improvement is.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate all that information. I'm going to take a minute and switch gears. So I want to start to just think about, kind of ask a totally different question, get away from talking about open source so much, but ask a question to the entrepreneurs. What has your experience been? Do blockchain companies need to have patents to secure funding? Angel investors, VC funding, or otherwise, and just kind of a general discussion having to do that based on your own experience, or and what you can add to the conversation there. And I guess I'd start with maybe Tom and Christian, see what you guys think about that.
That's a good question. I would say that I spent a long time in Silicon Valley and built a company there, and patents weren't really brought up as standard conversational points. I would say most companies there pretty much focused on winning through sheer network effect domination. If you look at Facebook as an example, pretty hard to take down, right? As a company that's entirely driven by network effect, which is what a vast majority of the companies out there are driven by. So if that is the case, if that's the kind of company that you're building, I would argue that the patentable technology probably doesn't matter as much, because you're just, through sheer domination and owning the market through some sort of hyper-growth strategy, able to keep competitors at bay simply because of that. But then again, you sort of look at the, I guess, next phase of that, once they've become a dominant player, now they're starting to drive R&D around various patents. Even Facebook is starting to get into the game in a pretty big way. And I think they've risen in the ranks and I think IBM's like #1 or something like that of all patents filed ever, right? And I think Facebook, is now in the top 10 at least. They weren't quite there before. But I think once you have the balance sheet, you can do stuff like that in a pretty significant way. I would bet that from a hardware perspective or pharmaceuticals, probably just depends on the industry and the business that you're in. Certain types of patents probably become more important. That would be my answer to that.
I just have a follow-up for you, Tom, too.
Yeah.
And that's that. So,
but I don't think it makes you don't have to worry about that from a fundraising perspective, at least,
sure,
depending on the category of business you're building.
Yeah, and fundraising is a great opportunity for me. And for those of you that don't know, Tom was a founder of a company, a website called rally.org, and so, which became, it was a big company, right? And there's a great backstory, there's a great success story, and so I think that I'd love to hear what sort of IP did you guys have at Rally? Was there anything innovative that you worked on? Did you guys ever pursue any patents? Or I'm sure it certainly had some trademarks, I'm sure.
We definitely had trademarks, mainly because people definitely tried to copy our brand.
Right.
And then tried to represent themselves as us in other parts of the world. So we had to do a whole global trademark process on that to protect our ability to function as a fundraising platform in multiple jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of patentable tech, we came up with a lot of really cool stuff. Most of the stuff that we came up with was more, I would probably say, fraud prevention. Just different ways to, under the hood of Rally was basically a payments company, right? So we processed and moved money all over the world. We moved billions of dollars for politicians and nonprofits. And I think in terms of like what we did, that's honestly where PayPal had most of their innovations, actually, is in fraud prevention opportunities, because it's extraordinarily hard to get people to stop ripping you off. So we came up with some really cool things there. Nothing we ever really patented. Most of what I would say we did is we took a really broken payment system and we put lipstick on a pig and we made it work a little bit better by just sheer user experience and focusing on a particular industry vertical and a lot of really good payment tech and user experience, I would say. But yeah, I would say most of the innovation probably happened more at the fraud prevention level.
Okay.
Yeah,
thanks for that. Christian, you want to weigh in?
Reluctantly, yeah. So, the caveat being, I think Gradient is I wouldn't say we're a blockchain company per se, but we have applications in the blockchain space, and therefore a lot of what we do would be classified as hardware development. Some of it is also distributed systems and more generally classified as blockchain. So, outside of that context, my background is in healthcare and medtech type things primarily, and in that space, establishing a core patent is essential for raising money generally. So coming from that background into a space that is that at least interfaces with blockchain has been very interesting. and nuanced, which is why I say reluctantly, talking about patents. So when we raised our first funding round, we have like fairly sophisticated investors who understand the value of patents long term. I would say in the blockchain space specifically, patents aren't, and they can actually be discouraging. And I think that that's mostly a cultural, educational issue, which hopefully we get into today.
Sure.
So in terms of, is it important for raising your first round of funding? I would say no. I think, for us, we were at an interesting point where we build silicon, so it's a very capital-intensive industry. The incumbents, and I think this is another interesting challenge, less so about do you need patents for securing funding and more about long-term strategy. There is a general assumption within or if not an assumption, a mentality within the blockchain community that patents are bad and patents inhibit innovation. I think that's actually potentially the opposite of what is the case. But coming from something like medtech, essentially what happens in the medtech industry and other capital-intensive industries is that every major player has their large their pile of patents, and you sort of have this like mutually assured destruction process where if it's not formally documented, there's a general assumption that I won't sue you, you won't sue me. If I were to come to the table as an incumbent and not have any patent protection, and say, well, I just didn't believe in patenting, you're not going to get very far. So, so our strategy with regard to patents is, and I think we'll get into this later on, but if you think of, I can patent, I can open source license, and I can trade secret. I suppose I could just throw everything out in the public as well. Filing IP is I think the most, it's the most general purpose option in terms of what you want to do in the future, and so that's kind of how we pursue things. So it gives us the ability to protect against large incumbents like an IBM, like an Intel. But of course, we love IBM and Intel if you're listening, and allows us the optionality in the future.
I would say like I've only recently been exposed to patents as like a viable like thing that you need to do, but not in the sense of monetizing my own business, but protecting my business.
Yeah.
Which is kind of weird.
Spending money to protect your business.
Spending money to protect my business so that somebody else doesn't walk away and say, oh, I did this thing 10 years ago because it's a first-to-file system.
Yeah.
And then, now I'm going to sue you because I happen to write a piece of paper faster. So we've actually like built stuff and like seen a patent come out. We're like, well, that sucks. Yeah. We built it.
Well,
it's funny.
Yeah. Something you brought up earlier, which I think is not immediately obvious, is that there are geographic distinctions on this cultural preference. So Silicon Valley is very, if you're raising money in Palo Alto or Menlo Park, I would say almost with certainty that no one cares if you have patents early on. Yeah. In fact, they may say, like, why are you wasting your time?
That's exactly what they say.
Yeah. May or may not have heard that one recently.
I've heard that 100 times.
In Boston, I think partly because of our medtech leaning and deep tech, it's sort of like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Don't put too much money there, but you should be doing that.
I think that's right, because like in Silicon Valley, like they're basically really good at building viruses that spread around the web.
Yeah.
Right. But it's called Facebook.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Well, Christian, I almost stopped you at the beginning of when you're kind of talking, because that was, I think it's a really important point. There was, I had asked more than 4 people to be as part of this panel that are members of the blockchain community, and there was a general aversion to want to talk about, even if the whole point of having them to come talk was to just talk about how they're utilizing open source. That some folks were generally just unwilling to have any sort of conversation, to even sit in a panel of people that were pursuing things in a proprietary way.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's indicative that people just have very strong feelings and are impassioned. It's something that's happening. It's quick. It's exciting. And there really are. There's many exciting, great things going on. But I think that what we wanted to have, is this kind of important conversation today about how I just don't think things are just black and white.
Yeah.
I think that with all of these things, that it's a business decision on a case-by-case basis. So.
Actually, just one
Yeah.
quick addition to that, because I imagine our investors would not be thrilled if we didn't clarify half a dozen things as quickly as possible. I think what is misunderstood is that filing a patent or even having a patent granted doesn't mean that I can't later on open source something. I can grant licenses wherever I feel like, and I think the reality is the vast majority of things, if not everything, that's where we'll go. But again, it's the optionality early on that if I'm building something and my incumbent is a Fortune 10, I need some protections. And the related point of be curious to maybe get into what I think this is later on, but when people say open source versus patent, I think there is a general association between patent and black box. And when within the blockchain community in particular, and things that we work on that are related to the security, integrity, and authenticity of core systems, when people say, I want this open source, what I actually hear when I get into the details is, I want to be able to audit exactly what you're doing. And I think those two, that plus and open source are not the same thing. Well, those two may come together, but patent and auditability are not necessarily at odds.
That's a great point. Yeah. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question, or else we're going to answer all of them. They're going to flow from this anyways. But, so I guess, Sam, I'll let you start. How has, tell us a little bit about your company, how you got started, and then how open source has really meant a lot to the rapid development, of the sort of projects that you guys are working on, the nature of your business, and why you've made the decisions that you have.
Yeah, so my company's I'm on the opposite side of the spectrum of it. I'm having Mika's next to me. Because the conferences I go to and the people I engage with are entirely on the open source side of the argument. They're mainly anarchists, right? Like, I'm in the Bitcoin space. We're Bitcoin engineers. We work on Ethereum because it's simple enough, but what we work on is core protocol infrastructure, and all of that's open source. So the most of I guess the only license we've actually dealt with for the most part has been the MIT license that you mentioned, which seems like it's kind of a free-for-all versus the GPL. We actually ran into some trouble because we launched the cryptocurrency. It's a new cryptocurrency. It's a fork of Bitcoin and ZCL called Anon with masternodes and ZK SNARKs that were actually developed here at MIT. And we forgot to put the MIT copyright, or not copyright, the MIT license on the code base. And immediately when we actually committed the code, we just bombarded with messages and pull requests, and you need to put this license in there. And I've never filed for a patent. I'm not I don't really know much about patents, so I wasn't entirely sure what the implications would be. But my community and the stuff that we do is entirely open source. I do bleed into the enterprise a bit with Oracle, for instance, and I've been to IBM's research center. I teach cryptocurrency and blockchain development at Miami-Dade College. So they flew me out to IBM's research center, and I got to speak with them and see how they're utilizing Hyperledger's Fabric and Composer. But patent, I guess, in the blockchain space, from my experience, seems to make more sense on the enterprise side. My clients who've done token raises or things of that nature haven't needed to do so yet. A lot of the things they architect in their white papers and things that I've helped them with definitely could qualify as patents, but they haven't gone that route yet. But most of what I do, most of the experience I have is entirely in the open source side.
Sure, and Sam, your Bushido Labs is primarily like a design shop, also, right?
Yeah.
So you're a service provider within the industry, helping to build out solutions for people that need core engineers like you have in your team to solve some of these difficult engineering problems, right?
Right. So we generally, and this is more of my position, I generally think that Blockchain protocols aren't complete yet. People say that Bitcoin's done, Bitcoin succeeded, or Ethereum is done, and focus on secondary applications or kind of ancillary utility of general blockchain protocols. But we basically service blockchain for clients' needs, right? The best part about this is that I learned about pain points in industries that I wouldn't have learned about otherwise, right? In logistics or in healthcare or in anything else, really. And it's really cool to actually architect or try and architect a solution for them on the protocol side. Because, ICOs kind of have a bad rap and kind of justifiably so to most of the extent. But it's interesting trying to target a specific solution within a business that's based on legacy applications and apply as much as we can of this distributed network system with things like masternodes. I don't know if many of you know what masternodes are, but they basically provide a service to a blockchain and facilitate passive income, which is really interesting because then you can have like what really could be like ETFs that utilize masternodes, right? So that's kind of the stuff that we do. We're a 9-man team of all engineers, so we're basically like a design shop, kind of like a lab, which is why I called it Bushido Lab.
I think it's interesting that Sam is a neuroscientist by his educational background is a neuroscientist, and so I'm always intrigued by how people end up where they are, right? It's kind of a point of interest for me. What about when thinking about building something? Tom, you mentioned where almost everything you've done so far has just been, relying on open source, maybe not formally, but keeping things, trade secret, never making or publishing them. And what's brought about, at least giving some thought towards protecting some of the things that you're developing? Is it because you're making a shift towards developing a product? Is it because you guys are starting to the phase of business development that you're in requires this next step? What is it that has you starting to think about these things?
I would say part of the reason that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about patents, and we've actually been thinking about it quite a bit more. If you think about a smart contract, you could almost classify it as like a licensing agreement, right? And you have to pay money to a wallet to use it, right? So if you think about just that in general, what does that mean for software? And how does that concept scale? So it's interesting that maybe a lot of people from blockchain community don't want to do that, but in order to use the virtual machine, I have to basically agree or follow a set of conditions, feed the machine money, and then I can effectively use that machine, right? So it's not technically a US government-backed patent, but I am basically paying to use a piece of software that I, in most cases, find it very difficult to reverse engineer, right? And so I just want to put that out there for the broader community, right? Part of the reason that we've really...
Well, it's a big challenge of open source, right? Is that there's no
yeah.
There's no help desk, which you call it.
There's no, yeah.
Support you with these things, right? It's kind of just sift through it and kind of navigate on your own, right?
Yeah, I think there's going to be some really interesting innovations happening that will sidestep government in that vein. But I would say that part of the reason that we've been looking at it is we walk into a lot of very large companies and we do a lot of prototyping projects for them. And they want to invest significantly in this technology because at the end of the day, it's governance, business, process automation, right, at its best. And for big companies, like if you walk into a big company, they're basically a gigantic firm of lawyers who are really good at filling out paperwork, right? And it's mostly process, it's mostly governance. And if you can automate that, that's going to fundamentally change the efficiencies of just about every major company on the planet. And big companies are beginning to understand that. And I think that's really interesting. and typically they've been hesitant for the GPL reasons that, you know, you're typically battling, you know, some sort of general counsel inside of a big company that says, well, hey, you know, we've spent $40 billion investing in our infrastructure. Why would we give it away for free, right? And a lot of that is just sort of old school thinking because they're not necessarily familiar with the new economic model that's going to come out of blockchain in terms of value creation. They have to put on a completely different lens in terms of understanding how value is going to be created in the future. And so as we've kind of gone in the door, we've had to help some of our clients kind of navigate that because their typical response is, let me just patent that, let me own that. But a lot of the benefits that you get from blockchain is competitors sitting on shared infrastructure, right? So you can gain the efficiencies of a monopoly without necessarily being a monopoly, right? And that's kind of cool in a sort of distributed and decentralized way. And so, you know, they see all this stuff, and so they're trying to figure out how to navigate it. And at the same time, they're beginning to build things where they're going to have to play with competitors because that's just simply going to make infrastructure more efficient and their businesses more efficient. And then people are doing patents at the same time, right? So you have the IBMs of the world who are doing a lot of blockchain patents, and people are getting scared because they're very used to IBM walking in the door and saying, you owe us money, or some other company, right? You have to pay this licensing agreement because I did this. And so in most cases, our conversations are rooted in how do we protect your future ability to operate? And I'm not a patent attorney at all. And so I called Keegan. And he's been extremely helpful in helping us understand that particular dynamic. Having released, you know, decentralized apps and things like that, and then immediately within a week, there's some sort of CoinDesk article on a app that's like pretty darn similar, and it's a little disheartening. You're like, you know, that's a application for some future thing you want to build, and we actually just built it in 3 months. And so we've had to help our clients kind of navigate that and think about that. We're also kind of, we've built a lot of internal custom tools to work with our clients. And so we've also been exploring and like, I've never open sourced anything, but I've also not necessarily like needed to. We've used a lot of open source, Node.js, Kubernetes, all that stuff. But you know, we're exploring open sourcing something that we've built, and what does that process look like, and how can we get others to contribute to it? Is a patent the right process? Is a dual approach better? So right now it's like very early conversations for us, but we definitely like want to put out into the world some of the things that we've built.
Thanks. Sure, yeah.
Was the efficiency. So my partner and I just had a conversation yesterday. We're going to be developing our own internal products. So this was like, what's our first product going to be? And we kind of narrowed that down. But his question to me was, is it going to be open source or are we going to close source? And my answer was a little bit of both. And the reason for that being is that you get a wealth of knowledge from having your code open source, right? There is no help desk, but given that there are so many developers now in existence, and there's so many developers that are developing in the blockchain space because they want to, and market cap also helps, you get a really interesting mix of actors. So for this coin that we just made, at fork, normally what you do is you fork a coin and you have the entire old history of the blockchain, and that's part of your new blockchain. We didn't want that old bloat. We wanted everyone to run a node and have kind of a fresh copy, right? So we just brought in the UTXOs, the unspent transaction outputs from both chains, and merged them together. The problem is on the Z Classic chain, it's a privacy coin, you have ZK snarks, meaning that there isn't anything really inside of those transactions. It's very difficult to parse through. So we just had a Russian guy who saw the project and started to write some Python utility for it. And then we started to communicate with him, and this is all open source, and he wasn't getting paid, we weren't paying him. But once we finished that, we then committed that, and it credited him, as this is an open source Python utility to scrape through ZK snark UTXOs. So it gets to me to get help, but there's definitely a lot of utility in that open source for sure.
I agree.
Sure. I mean, I think it would be hard to imagine a world without open source, right? Like we wouldn't have, the internet wouldn't exist in the form that it does today. We wouldn't have the Googles and the Facebooks and the huge tech giants that we have today. We wouldn't have most of the innovations that we have today if it wasn't for that. You know, it seems to move much faster than our standard proprietary cycle. So it's an important point that I think that there's a place for both. Christian, you brought up a good, an interesting point.
May not be a good point.
Yeah. I'm agnostic in that sense. So you're, you do have this med tech background where, even to get out of the gate, really, like, you have to have some sort of protection of whatever it is that you're working on, right? Or
right.
just to secure some funding or to really get going, at least have a solid plan, right? For protecting it if you don't have some. And then kind of entering into a bit of a new realm, somewhat still in the same, working with, developing chips, but for a new application and working with this new shift that we, with a new technology that we're working with and seeing everywhere. And then you brought up this point about kind of the divide of thought processes and how people think about this. So as you've made that shift from being in the med tech community to shifting towards the crypto community, has that, what are the sort of considerations that you're thinking about? Because I know quite a bit about what it is that you're doing, but I know that you rely on open source is a really important part of all this too. So what has that shift been like?
Yeah, well, so I think another interesting shift that's happening right now is so we build one of the core components in what Gradient does is essentially a secure root of trust built into silicon. We can build it into other things, for things like the recent foreshadow attack on Intel's secure or software guard extensions, Spectre meltdown, all of the attacks on the processors that we all use every day. There was a big movement within academia, at least, to say, why don't arguably one of the reasons why those attacks were successful is that Intel was very opaque about how they architected their processors, and this is relevant in a second. If you look at the groups, actually there's a group here at CSAIL that led some of the work on understanding the likely vulnerabilities of those core processors. And the way that they did that is that the lead graduate student read all of Intel's patents, and he formulated a hypothesis of how this processor was working, and they'd send their idea to. They would solicit information as to whether or not this was accurate and iterate through, and they got to a point where it seemed like their theory was close to how this thing worked. Published this is probably a bad idea. We should probably improve this architecture, and all this led to this idea that, hey, if this stuff had just been open source from the beginning, or at least published cleanly, so it was auditable, then these kinds of attacks wouldn't happen. And sort of similar to the point of with open source, one of the benefits is that you get a lot of people checking for vulnerabilities and looking for and helping to improve a core code base. So, so I think that there's both in the hardware side and the software side, there is an interest. Hardware side is there's becoming an interest and a desire to see open source hardware, which traditionally was not a thing. Practically speaking, there are really big challenges in making true open source hardware. But I think that the middle ground that we've taken, seeing the benefits of both sides, it's frankly beneficial to not expose exactly how we architect something, both from protection perspectives in terms of being copied by competitors who are much larger than us, also in terms of security by obscurity, although that's controversial, is that we will at the very least
publish our architecture so that they're fully auditable. And so I think there's a very interesting middle ground here where, and this gets back to the point I meant earlier in terms of when people push for open source within the blockchain community, I think what they really mean is auditable and traceable. And if you have something where we created a new architectural standard for something and there's a reasonable and non-discriminatory licensing model around it that supports an industry existing, like that may be an interesting middle ground versus just we're going to be the next Intel or AMD.
To that point, I think it's worth noting that openness and transparency and publishing, at least making your code, if you will, whether it's hardware or software, publicly available, is not mutually exclusive with a patent strategy, because the fundamental thing that patents are supposed to do, the deal that they're supposed to make, is that you're telling everybody how you implement things, at least to some extent. And in exchange, you get a monopoly on the idea. You release your ideas to the world. It was kind of the open source of its day.
Yeah.
You release your ideas to the world. You receive a form
of
of protection in return. And as a result, innovation can go forward. The problem is that no matter what system you come up with to protect people's property and to release information, people are going to find ways to exploit it to their benefit. That has happened with patents many times. It's happened with open source.
Mm-hmm.
It's a common phenomenon for companies to take open source concepts that are developed in a little garden that they curate and then mine it for applications and innovations sort of budding off of that, and then basically try to corner the market on the valuable aspects, the fruit of the garden, if you will. So coercion, property you could think of as information plus coercion. And coercion can come in many forms, even in the form of viral network dominance.
Well, so the blockchain space, I think, is at this, it's sort of like this vulnerable child right now, I think, because people are coming in saying, I have no idea how patents work. I hear they're bad, and we don't patent things. And so we're going to open source everything. And oh look, the big scary guys who used to come in with their patent litigation groups are now creating these open source consortiums, and everything is good. What's probably actually going to happen there is exactly what Mike just articulated, which is if you create a consortium, make everything open and free, and mine that for the best possible stuff and patent it. I just think that there's this there's a naivete that may face a bit of a reckoning.
The big scary guys are always going to be big and scary. That's
we're not worried, but
oh well, you're scary too.
So I think that all of you guys bring up a great point there, and that I think that kind of an underlying theme that everyone is addressing is that it seems like one of as we think about how we can really add value for entrepreneurs listening tonight, is that it seems for like each company there's a handful of decisions that you need to make based on wherever it is that you are and in the sort of company that you have and whatever that your goals are, and weighing all of those things and then looking at the marketplace or the industry in which you're operating as well, and in considering maybe what the best path is for you. And so Sam, I'd be curious, just because because I'm curious, that I'd like to hear maybe you just talk about, since we've touched on like the no help desk issue of open source or things like that, maybe you could just weigh in briefly like on some of the pros and the cons of utilizing open source from your vantage point with the sort of service business that you have.
Yeah, I'll go back to the coin example because it's just the most recent. Someone else contributed code and wanted to help out, but they were actually just trying to steal coin. But we didn't figure that out until a little bit later, while we vetted his code. So you get good and bad actors everywhere. I guess the equivalent to the help desk in the open source space would be like forums. One of my engineers fundamentally believes that if you don't know how to code in 15 years, you're going to be on food stamps. I wouldn't really go that far, but we are seeing an increased presence of developers, right? My sister, who she has a hard time sending emails. She now wants to go to a boot camp to learn JavaScript or Ruby on Rails. So I don't know if that's indicative of like a more open source community in general. I'm not entirely sure, but I've experienced its utility firsthand. You do have to be careful because again, it's kind of like they call crypto the Wild West, but you're on the internet. It's the internet. So you do have to tread cautiously, but yeah, I think it's incredibly useful to kind of take the MVP model of this is what I have, iterate, this is what I have, iterate again and again. Have people, normally you have your users break it, but you could really just have developers break it if you have open source code.
So one point that brings up, and maybe it comes up later, is mission critical systems and open source tend to be at odds. Like anything that utilizes open source in a mission critical application, whether it's automotive, aerospace, defense, healthcare, financial, usually you take an open source thing and you clean it all up and you fix all the stuff and you do formal methods around it to the point that the thing at the end is effectively proprietary, and it's not intentionally so. It's just that you need a very clean environment to operate certain types of things. And so I think that is one of the challenges that open source faces, and there are a number of like DARPA programs right now around trying to make that cleaner, particularly around reusable hardware, electrical IP cores. But it's just it's great to see the iterative breaking and bug bounty type things, but how does that work when if we release something and it doesn't work, someone dies?
I might throw in one final comment, which is at the end of the day, like if you're building a company, you have to understand what your strategy is, right? It's like there's a lot of, whether it's patents or PR, like one of the big things that, if you think about it, a lot of people always want to get their startup covered in TechCrunch, right? So it makes them feel good, right? But does it actually do anything for your company, right? No, generally not, right?
Tom, can I actually just interrupt real quick?
Yeah.
Because you're going to answer my last question
great.
now. Yeah, so,
Great.
And then we'll move on to the audience question. So the last question is really just, I guess I'm going to modify what I have written down a little bit, but what are some kind of final considerations that you guys think, that as entrepreneurs, that people starting new companies should be thinking about as they make these sort of considerations, thinking about how to utilize open source code or thinking about making things proprietary? What are the questions that they should be asking themselves?
What's your strategy? I think that's really, at the end of the day, really think very clearly about it. Take it slow. Most of the really successful companies took 10 years to build. They didn't actually happen overnight. So just think about that. Take the slow boat. I see a lot of entrepreneurs that want to get that TechCrunch headline, right? Because I think it's going to help them raise money, but that's probably not very true. But if you're thinking about it strategically and you're like, okay, I have like a sales funnel, I'm going to drive traffic, I'm going to track that inbound traffic through a user acquisition funnel that's going to convert at some conversion rate to some sort of monetizable like strategy, then go get that press, right? Because it makes sense. And at my previous company, we thought a lot about that. And you try to go out and get press and you feel good, right? But at the end of the day, what we ultimately discovered was, hey, every single time a media outlet writes about a rally or GoFundMe or any of these things, it drives an enormous amount of traffic to a page that has a very clear 8.5% conversion rate on checkout with a ticket size of $85. So do that all day long, right? That's a great business. But that's a strategy, right? So that's my thought.
Yeah.
Sam?
I would say know your space. know it very well. I used to write in the domestic partner that I'm currently engaged with, which is my way of saying girlfriend, she's big on musicals. So Lin-Manuel Miranda for Hamilton. I don't like musicals. I don't know why you have to sing them. Like everything. So she told me that Lin-Manuel's thing is you need to write within your experience. I kind of apply that to entrepreneurship as well. You need to know your space. I know blockchain very well. I don't know medical as well, and I don't know like logistics very well. But I know blockchain infrastructure very well, so I'm able to manipulate it kind of at will.
Your space.
I think blockchain is a weird animal. And I think what we're doing that I think is helping us a lot, and I would like to see other projects and companies do is really understand what exactly what is your product and who cares. It seems like it's a very basic question that in most startup arenas is a necessary series of questions to ask and answer. But you look at the existing blockchain space and where do you see a product with an end user with a reasonable user base? I'm going to anger a lot of people, but I'd say there aren't any. There are tremendous amounts of capital that have been raised, and they've yet to be realized as products. And so I think a product-focused, product-centric perspective, and then take your time to build it. And it's okay to change what the product is, but otherwise I think we're building a lot of things that don't really go anywhere.
I would say,
Micah, you want to give a final word here?
yes. I would say all of these different approaches you can take to the product you're building involve disclosure in some way. And all I can say is it's very important to disclose your ideas consciously. Know who you're telling about them and know why you're telling them. If it's going to be released to the public, have a reason for that. It has to go with your strategy. It has to go with knowing the space you're in. Are you going to get more benefit from disclosing to the public and perhaps losing the ability to file for a patent later? Or are you going to get more benefit from keeping it mostly secret? Ideally, you'd make some sort of a zero-knowledge proof.
I was going to say, we could run all of this stuff in our hardware, and you would not have this problem.
Yes. Hey. So, yeah,
Okay.
Disclose intelligent.
All right, well, thanks so much, guys. I think I'd like to open it up to get some questions from people that came out to hear you talk tonight. Dan, maybe can you guys pass any questions that you might have, or write down any questions that you might have? There's little slips of paper at the end of each row, and or somewhere in your row, and if you want to jot down a question or two, and then pass those down the aisles, and we'll get those passed up. And that was on purpose.
Yeah.
No.
I'll just ask.
We do have some pens, right?
Well, people could just say their question and you could repeat it.
Ask and repeat.
Yeah.
Can do an ask and repeat. All right. All right. Who wants to go first? Would you like to ask a question?
I would.
All right.
For those of us in the general public, watching the general public, one of the things that unsettles us about blockchain is the risk of forks and some of the ugly stories working early on. Does the open source ecosystem lend itself to a greater risk of forks or less?
So the question for those in the live stream and anyone else that couldn't hear it was that there's a concern about forks in the public, and I guess generally how should people be concerned about those? I think Sam might be the best guy to take this question.
Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, 100%. If your code is open source, then you're at risk of people forking it. Definitely, which is why the crypto blockchain space is so interesting, because I tell everyone, and I tell my class this. Blockchain fundamentally is a combination of economics, computer science, and game theory, right? The game theory aspect is important to me. The environment the environment that's been created with your open source code is important. So the incentive structure people have, which really is just mechanism design and game theory, is important. None of those things are isolated. You can't really target any one of those components in a silo. I think it's just kind of a weird amalgam. But yeah, I mean, to answer your question, yes. If your code is entirely open source, then anyone can fork it or copy it. We just did.
Has anyone jotted down any questions that they have? No. Okay. Christian, did you want to add to that?
So it's sort of timely. I have a wager going related to this, not denominated in water futures apparently, but so if you think about what about the architecture of a blockchain allows forking, and is it possible to architect distributed ledger technologies that don't suffer from this fork issue? And I think you can. That the challenge, that the mechanism that gives rise to this fork issue really is around how consensus is established. And so are there other ways to reconsider how we create and maintain consensus in such a way that you don't have these fork vulnerabilities? Mm-hmm. That's an explicit thing that we are interested in enabling. And my take is that until that is fixed, blockchains won't be largely adopted.
Yeah, that's something that we talked about a little bit, Tom, on a project, and I'm stuttering a little bit because I lost my train of thought halfway through that. I can't remember exactly the project that it had to do with a client of yours that we're working on a smart contract solution. No, I can't remember it. I'll come back to it. I'll remember it.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's mostly just a governance issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a governance issue, and you have an ecosystem of people that like to yell at each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If you follow them on Twitter, it's like that's not really a good form of governance.
Right, and that blockchains need
And then
good
you get
data.
bets and water features.
That's right.
But isn't that, and this may be more naive, which I admittedly am on this panel, isn't
No.
it just a consequence of the free market where if your product is better, then you lost? Kind of like a MySpace versus Facebook Twitter?
Yeah.
I'm actually asking, I don't know.
What?
Christian.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know who you were
asking.
I mean, so I think governance is another big thing. I'm pessimistic as to the ability of permissionless systems and open projects to maintain good governance, and so I default to, can we sort of have governance by construction? But absent that, yes.
We spend a lot of time in more of the federated chain concept.
Yeah.
The permissionless systems are going to take a really long time, I think. But you can definitely gain most of our projects are in, federated chain concepts where there's a lot of incentive for even competitors to operate on a shared infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
right? Network resiliency being one of them. So I think that's kind of a really interesting, because you can also architect governance. You can kind of make things a little bit more refined. I think eventually they'll solve it in more of a permissionless framework, but I think that is going to take a lot of time. And it may not even be the blockchains that you see today that have scale. It may be actually some entirely new concept that we're not familiar with.
It seems to be, industry specific too. It's hard to talk about the way that forks function without talking about a specific industry. And even within a specific industry, you almost need to talk about whatever the specific application is. And so that's really what I remember what I wanted to talk about now. And that's that, I came to help on a project, or to just weigh in as an expert. And during a brainstorming session, and we were working on this issue of that, you just can't put bad data on
you know, a blockchain, you know, and like,
We can.
we can, right?
May
But
not
then
be a
we
good
end up,
idea.
you know, exactly, and then we have to resolve that somehow, you know, and so, and that was in, you know, like a logistics sort of space, and so then, if you think about it, like in a medical space, it might have a different, you know, the solutions may be a little bit different, but I think that the core solution is still like starting at the smallest point and making sure, you know, making sure that whatever the data that's going on there, in the first place, it is correct, at least in certain industries, right? And depending on the actual functionality of it.
Yeah, I think like when we roll into an engagement, I would say 9 times out of 10 we're cleaning up process. Most cases we're cleaning up people's broken processes. You'll be amazed at how many like massive $800 billion organizations like still actively use Excel spreadsheet, right, and email them to each other to like make deals, and it's just like, wow, this is a house of cards, right? But yet, you know, they still function.
Don't knock Excel, Tom.
No, I'm not knocking Excel per se, but like,
So I've done all that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You're addressing the issue of forking. You said something I didn't quite follow. That the barrier to adoption would be that consensus around forking or something?
Oh, yeah. So I mean, this is probably not the mainstream view. Most things I say are probably not mainstream blockchain views. But so, for example, if you look at Bitcoin as a network, it's a proof of work based network. The robustness, to the extent that it is robust, I mean, it's robust. It comes from having large numbers of nodes working together, right? And so when you have these fork disputes, they come in a couple of different flavors. Like one is sort of, might say like standards related. So there's this, you know, Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin and a couple other things. And that's one where it was, you know, to Tom's point about governance, there wasn't sort of super clear governance on how do we adopt new standards. And so basically the entire community is just split in half and you could pick. My point around fork resolution was more around the fact that a number of distributed consensus-based frameworks sort of have built in that to achieve robustness, you have the ability to roll back the state of the system. And for purposes of implementing architectures that we power as a company, we don't think that's good enough. If you have to roll it back, we broke. And so that's why I say alternative consensus mechanisms may enable that. And if, so for example, if I'm in a financial network and I can make certain assurances that I'll never like roll back a transaction operating on that network. My view is that most players would like that because it makes, you know, economics work. And so that's what I meant.
I guess one question I had in general with blockchain and facilities it provides is some point in the future, will blockchain facilities be viewed kind of like public utilities? Will that be kind of a role for government at some point? That's kind of what's been rolling around in my head because it sounds like it should be a fundamental utility available to everyone.
These guys made.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. So I had a opportunity. I sat down with John Scully in sort of a small group session, and he said, you know, technology is either beautiful or invisible, and I think that's a really powerful idea. Blockchain is invisible, right? It should be. We shouldn't actually know about it. We shouldn't really understand it. Like what we really care about are the applications that are going to be built on top of it, right? The user
should just pick it up and it works.
Yeah, the telephone works, right? Do we think about like the switching and VoIP and all these different things? Like, no, we don't even think about that. But we definitely know about YouTube and we know Uber, right? We understand how to interact with each other on in those applications. Blockchain is not a whole lot different, right? Eventually, you know, the blockchain tech itself, nobody's really going to be talking about it probably in 10 years. right? But they'll probably talk about a lot about the applications that are built on top of it. So public utility is kind of, I think,
That'll get rid of the whole thing of mining of Bitcoins to create.
well, there will be that's part of like consensus and all that stuff. There will be entirely new consensus models that we can't even fathom today, probably. There's so much innovation happening there, it's not even funny. So,
Yeah.
I don't know, that's my thought.
But I think the notion of a public utility, I think that there are these, what's difficult coming into what, like, sort of the crypto native side of blockchain. I'm told I'm not crypto native. Wearing a button-down shirt to first meetings was a big mistake. Is that there's this aversion to anything that could potentially be censored or manipulated, and so there's this view that government and governance that is sovereign is bad. And at the same time, for any of these architectures to be widely adopted, you have to deal with, anti-money laundering laws, know your customer laws. And so there's this weird ground of, like, there are several companies, with market caps of 10 billion plus, who have managed that successfully, but they're viewed much less positively than, say, Bitcoin. So I think that'll be a cultural evolution as well.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways too, like if you think about just the issue of identity, like forget about blockchain.
Yeah.
Identity is a massive problem in general.
Yeah.
And it's a two-sided network. So on the one hand, it's like, I need a network that has lots of identities on it. Hopefully they're valid.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I need organizations that care about networks that have billions of identities so that it's actually useful to me.
Yeah.
Right? And so like you have to scale up both at the same time, which is extremely difficult. And so it's a massive, so in a certain way, you're going to need probably governments who are the issuers of identity, period, the end, right? You want an identity, you have to go through a government. And they're valid, right? You get a passport, you've been cleared. And you have a certain jurisdiction that you're associated with, but how do you get that clearance as an identity and then get that verified identity onto a network so it's useful to a bank, right? Who has to follow a certain law that says, they need to have KYC, AML,
Yeah.
right? Which is, if they don't do it, then the federal banking commission or state banking commission usually rolls in the door and shuts them down if they don't respond within 30 days. So it's a real problem.
But then how does all that square with your desire for privacy?
Well, and you can do that totally private, in private ways too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's. We should talk.
Yeah.
For a while, we are
No such thing.
distinguished bunch here, very knowledgeable people. I have a background in medical and legal, but know very little about blockchain, especially with reference to the last question. Are any of you familiar with the concepts put forward by Wes Kumal in Quiet Enjoyment, where he talks about true authenticity versus untrue authenticity and security fraud, PKA, and all this stuff, and a massive digital signatures that can quantify some of this openness versus closedness and lead to patentability. And if any of you have that familiarity, I think Wes actually founded Delphi way back in the 80s.
Oh yeah, Delphi method.
Rupert Murdoch, and then went downhill. And he's had this whole concept of the city of Osmio, public and private digital signatures, true authenticity. Are you a real carbon copy molecular form of yourself? Or in the case, I believe it was Citibank, recently discovered 388 individual accounts that were traced down to one real carbon copy of one person. So the security fraud, and then back to what was talked about earlier, it seems to me as you move into this open garden and you mine in, get out, and protect, things that were discussed by all of you, that there'll be a good chance of protecting what's important to you and your investors, but it would also get us down the road a little further with this consensus business. And I really plead ignorance. I might sound like a riddle on this, but I found that concept very interesting. And it sounds like
and it's going to be
this group, I don't know.
an even bigger problem when you have 100 billion new identities because they're devices, right? And they have to be authenticated, and they all have wallets, and you can steal from them.
That's right.
Right?
Much of these
And somebody
stop
owns
with your
them.
They stop with your smart instrument.
Yeah,
They
or
don't get
smart
into
algorithms.
the carbon copy of the real.
Yeah. Where does that go and who
Does
controls
that
them?
fit with any of this? You can,
Yeah,
It's interesting, yeah.
a lot. We'll publish something on this in a couple of months. But yeah, I think that's like that is one of the big issues of. There was an article published in Harvard Business Review, I think, by one of the researchers at MIT, also named Christian, where it was what blockchain can't do, and one of the things was this link between the physical and the digital world.
Yeah.
That's something we're very, very like. That is at the core of what Gradient does, and I think one of the interesting things that you brought up is this sort of biological identity versus electronic physical or electronic digital identity. And linking those things, doing so in a way that's immutably linked, but does not then, so the nightmare scenario there would be, I create that linkage and somehow part of that, there are ways to do that and then attest your identity anonymously. So there's something called a direct anonymous attestation. IBM Research did a lot of work on this. If that architecture is broken at various points, the nightmare is that I can now like reverse de-anonymize everything you've ever done, and that's not a happy scenario either. So it's definitely at the root, I think, of making these things work.
And this concept, you have one individual identity, and you're right, it can only be gotten to a court order, like Fort Knox, or they call this city of Osmio, or in Switzerland or whatever. You have that only available by court order. And there's public and private sides of this. Like if you're dealing with driver's license, property, public, that's different than private. The difference between getting rear-ended with your car, is a very private, quiet, enjoyment person until you get rear-ended and the police come and then all of a sudden we get driver's license and all this. So there's ways to do it.
Yeah. Glenn, I'm just going to stop you only because Tom was even nice enough to do this talk tonight, and he has a hard stop at 7:30 and needs to go get on a plane. And I don't want to be the guy that makes him miss that plane because this was a big ask to have him be part of the panel tonight. So I just want to let everyone know, I guess, that we're headed over to Mead Hall and drinks and some food on me if you want to come. So come on over. I think we're upstairs. Is that right, Katja?
Yep.
And I just want to kind of quickly say thanks again to all of you guys, each one of you in particular and in different ways, inspires me and helps me strive towards being better in my own business. We're the startup version of a law firm, and seeing the way that you guys operate, is. You guys each have like these little kind of cultural things in your companies that works really well for you, and they're all very different, and it's so nice for me to have that kind of window in to all these unique, really high growth, high thought companies. It's an exciting time, and I'm really happy that I get to be part of it. And thanks you guys for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And the final thanks to just my team, our team at Caldwell Intellectual Property Law, who really helps makes a lot of this possible so that we can do little events like this. We want to give back to our community how we can.